So there's a scene quite early in Sound of Metal where Ruben is starting to discover that he's losing his hearing and he is desperately trying to find answers for it, and he goes to the pharmacy and he speaks to a doctor to try and figure out what's going on, what can he do. And Ruben can't hear the doctor's struggling to get Ruben to understand what he's saying. He enunciates his words, but Ruben's not getting it, and it's just the stressful situation. Why can't they communicate? And I'm thinking, why doesn't the doctor just write something so that Ruben can read, and then the communication will be all better? And then I remember, it's a doctor. Ruben wouldn't be able to read it anyway. Welcome to Indecent. My name is Vincent and I'm here to take a look at some indie films, both old and new, to help you find what could be your next favorite movie. So if you have a heart for passion projects and low budget masterpieces, consider subscribing to my quest on the journey to find the ultimate independent productions. But without wasting any more time, let's dive right into my personal thoughts and feelings on Sound of Metal. Sound of Metal is a 2019 American drama film directed and co-written by Darius Marder. It stars Riz Ahmed as a heavy metal drummer whose life is thrown into freefall when he begins to lose his hearing. So before I continue, I'd just like to explain to you how we do things here. So there's two sections to this video, a spoiler-free section and a spoiler section. We'll first be having a spoiler-free conversation, which is indicated by this graphic that you see in the corner. And when we eventually move to spoiler talk, it will also be indicated by this graphic. But before I even talk about Sound of Metal, I just want to address something. So a lot of you have been complaining, saying, Another Round isn't an indie movie, it won an Oscar. I Lost My Body isn't an indie movie, it was nominated for an Oscar. Sound of Metal isn't an indie movie, it was nominated for an Oscar. I get it. I understand that I look at indie movies, but I'm taking a lot of liberties with the term indie movie, and I'm basically deciding what I feel qualifies for that term. My goal at the end of the day is to get movies to people who maybe wouldn't have found them otherwise. And by gosh, if even one person out there saw Another Round because I recommend it to them, then it's a job well done. Not really, I want more than that, but I mean, come on, let's just discover cool movies together. Have some grace for my soul. I recorded that whole thing with my sunglasses on, although I already took them off. Continuity, Vincent, continuity. Anyway, now we finally arrived at my general thoughts on this movie. Sound of Metal is fantastic. I really loved this movie, and I really loved the intimacy of it, and I loved the struggle that's put on screen. It's a long movie, about 2 hours in length. Even though there are some scenes which I felt were unnecessary or drawn out, it's a beautiful picture in its totality. There's an article that I read about this movie that really fascinated me, and I'm going to read from this article that you can find down in the link below from the Georgetown Voice. Sound of Metal is a sensory experience and utilizes complex sound design. The sound mixing alone was a 20-week process to represent Ruben's hearing loss. This film is about immersing its audience into the terror and disorientation of Ruben's sudden impairment. The film is very much about asking us societally what it is like for us as hearing people to merge into a culture where we are suddenly the minority. And I love that concept, and that's what the movie does really well, is as someone who has functioning ears who can hear, I felt like the minority. I felt lost. In fact, I was scrambling for subtitles halfway through this movie because with all the sign language and stuff, I felt like I didn't know what was going on. And I slowly came to the realization that that's the best way to view it. In fact, that's how I discovered this article, is we're supposed to feel confused. We're supposed to not know what's going on. We, the people with the capability to hear, are the minority in this case. And I love the feeling that it gives because I felt genuinely lost and helpless. And it made me empathize with Ruben because that's him permanently. He does not walk away after the credits roll. And just that thought haunted me. It gave me such a fear and an appreciation for the ability to hear, which we'll go more into down the line. But I wanted to set the stage with that. Something else that really contributes to the sound design of the movie is there's essentially no backtrack, no score, no soundtrack to this movie. As far as I can remember, there's the heavy metal music they play in the start of the movie, and there's the credit music. And I do not recall any soundtrack throughout the rest of the movie, which just makes the whole experience that much more immersive, because you understand this film is made to understand to you the value that we have, the privilege we have to have all our senses functioning, or at least our audio senses functioning. And I love the amount of attention to detail they have in regards to that. Interesting thing, I mentioned the heavy metal in this movie because essentially this movie is about a heavy metal drummer who loses his hearing. Funny enough, that does not feature nearly as much as I thought it would in the movie based on the trailer and the opening scene. I genuinely thought this movie would be about a guy who struggles to come to terms with the fact that he can't play his music anymore. I thought the loss would be the music, but the loss is completely focused on the audio, the loss of hearing, and very little on the music aspect of it, which I actually wanted a bit more of, if I'm honest, because this is very much a movie about a guy coming to terms with the fact that he can't hear anymore. And I was craving a little bit more of, you've lost your ability to live out your passion for music. Now, because that's a real thing, that is something he lost. The thing which he loved, he can no longer have. And I felt like they could have dived deeper into that. And this is not spoilers, because it's very clear from the first act of the movie that, okay, this is not what they're focusing on. As this movie was opening with the heavy metal sequence, I actually thought, okay, cool, I can get in one of my friends who has been in a band similar to Black Gammon, the band in the movie, and who was a drummer for that band. And I thought I'd be able to get him on a Zoom call and we'd talk about the realism and what he thought about that. And when no other sequences featured with the heavy metal music, I was like, okay, well, that's not happening. One thing I'll say though, because I've spent a lot of time, we used to work together, me and this friend of mine, and one thing they got right is freaking drummers, man, are always busy tapping, always tapping their feet, always tapping their fingers on the desks. And it's sometimes annoying, you know who you are, but it's just really cool to see how they paid attention to that detail, which just made me feel like this character, Ruben, even though it's portrayed by Riz Ahmed, it felt like it was a guy who was a drummer. And speaking of Riz Ahmed, he does such a fantastic job in this movie. And the thing about it is, seeing him in this makes me so excited to see him in more stuff. I'd love to see this guy in like a Marvel movie or a like action-packed movie. And I understand he was the villain in Venom, but so I'd love to see him in a meteor, action-packed role, because this guy worked out. He looks good. Man, I wish I could look like that. Anyway, enough said about that. All the characters are done well, with Ruben being the outstanding performance. And Olivia Cooke as Lou did a pretty good job, especially in the first half of the movie. I really appreciated her performance. But without question, Riz Ahmed is the standout actor in this movie. But before we move into spoiler talk, I just once again like to ask you to subscribe if you love supporting the little guy, the independent productions, because this in itself is an independent production. I do this all by my own, out of my love for movies. So support them by supporting me as I support them, and I appreciate it very much. Now we're going to go over into spoiler talk. Now, earlier in this video, I spoke about how scary the transitioning into his loss of hearing was, but I want to touch more on that in a more openly spoiler talk way. There's a scene in this movie, and it is quite early in the movie, where as Ruben realizes he's losing his hearing, he goes to the doctor and they do these audio tests where they ask him to repeat the word that they say, and they would say something like lid, and then he would say broom, and they would say life, and he would say give, and they would say talk, and he would say fall. And as it continues, there's this dread that filled my heart, this fear where it's like this guy is saying the wrong words. He's not hearing them. And as they continue, it just gets worse. And there gets a point where they start saying words and he just doesn't respond anymore, because he knows he's barely saying anything correct. Not even, he just knows that he's guessing. And there's this, especially in the first act of the movie, where they constantly play and use creative ways to show you his hearing loss. And it was terrifying to me. It really made me feel emotional, because it was so real. I don't know, I related with him in the sense of, okay, there's a problem, we need to find the solution before our emotions catches up with how horrible this is making us feel and how terrified we are. Let's focus on the solution, and maybe we can get there before we realize how bad this is. And throughout this whole movie, essentially, he's rushing to get to the solution before his emotions catch up with him. But they catch up. When those realizations hit, there's a few scenes in this movie, him losing his shit in the RV in the beginning, him losing his shit whilst in the room supposedly having to write, where it almost brought me to tears, because I personally related to it so much in terms of how I would deal with these overwhelming situations, especially the scene that really, really made me think internally was the scene where he had to say goodbye to Lou as she was driving away. And it really almost made me cry, because a little bit about me, as I was growing up, when I met my wife, I was about 17, and for the first half of our relationship, it was long distance, and I knew I was going to marry this woman the day I met her. So whenever we actually managed to see each other in person, there was nothing in the world more heartbreaking than us going our separate ways again, and I have no idea when I'm going to see her again. And maybe to a lot of people it would sound a tad dramatic, but for the type of person I am and the type of person that Ruben is, it's heartbreaking, because this person is the core of your emotions, and it's just like it's ripped away from you, and it really resonated with me. And the whole movie, I was just so scared that they were going to fall into the, oh, well, Lou doesn't like him anymore, now they're not together anymore thing. And I think they alluded almost too much towards something like that, but I'm really glad it's not what it got to. And there was a scene almost at the end of the movie where they're in Lou's bedroom, and he's just, and Ruben's just saying to Lou, you saved my life, you saved my life. And she is brought to tears saying, no, you saved my life. And just this, maybe an over dependency on one another, but I understand an over-dependency. I understood that. And not to make it personal, but just that outside perspective of seeing what that looks like, it was so heartbreakingly beautiful. That overwhelming sense of, I would not be who I am if it wasn't for you. You saved me out of a dark place. And I really loved that. And I wish I could have seen more of that in this movie. And maybe it's because I personally relate to it so much, but I would have enjoyed that aspect of this maybe a little bit more than just an hour and a half, essentially, of Ruben coming to terms with his hearing loss, where about half an hour of the movie is determined with the emotional coming to terms. I understand. I mean, it's a choice you make in regards to where you want to go with this. And then lastly, I want to talk about the ending, the final scene of the movie, where actually, to give a little bit of context to that, where the whole movie through, Ruben just wants this operation because he wants to get back what he lost. He believes he is inferior without his hearing, and he needs to get his hearing back. And fair enough, it is a disability. It is a loss to not have your hearing. But the place where he's at, they say to him, we approach this issue not as being deaf is a disability, not as you have lost something, but they want to teach you how to live with it. And Ruben has just not been able to make that decision. He wants to get back to being able to hear. He sees being deaf as a disability, as a loss, and as something that makes him inferior. And when he finally gets to the point where he can get the operation done and get the implants, and he gets this realization that these implants don't sound good. The audio quality, it's not hearing, it's not the same thing. And just this heartbreak that you see on his face, it broke my heart. And throughout the last few minutes of the movie, as he's realizing that he's not going to get the hearing back, there's a short period of time where he goes from, I have lost my hearing, to I need to be okay with this. And he sits in the park and he takes off his hearing aid and he smiles, because it is in that moment where he realizes that this is a part of his identity now. He cannot run away from it, but maybe it doesn't have to be what defines him. And it's a beautiful depiction of humanity, and it's a perfect ending to this movie, and it perfectly ties together the true subtext of this movie. And it is for that tying together that just boosts it an extra point for me. And it's for that reason that I really love this movie. But I should stop now, otherwise I'm going to get too emotional. I mean, listen to the beginning of this video versus the end, where my voice's frequency is just getting lower and lower. If you enjoyed this review, please like, and if you really enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. Other than that, I'm really looking forward to seeing you guys next time, where I hope I'd have an indie game review again for you. But that's it for now. Bye.